Hello and welcome to the 59th Annual New York Film Festival. I'm Dan Sullivan. I'm a programmer here at Film at Lincoln Center and a co-programmer of the festival's revival section. You've all just seen Radio On, 1979, directed by Christopher Petit. We are very, very happy and honored to be joined now by Chris. Hello, Chris Petit.
Hi, yeah, thank you for showing the film and inviting me.
Yeah. So why don't we just we'll get right into it, I guess, and maybe maybe it makes the most sense to start a little bit before the beginning, sort of talk about the background of the film, of the film's production, and sort of the context that you were the context that it came out of. I guess I think I'm especially interested in sort of, I mean, I think this is kind of an interesting moment for independent filmmaking in the UK when you made the film, and actually just in in culture generally, especially since that period had like a real feeling of culture sort of meeting this political climate that was going on, sort of maybe the kind of like the beginning of the ascendancy of the British right wing, as we would see in the 80s very heavily. Could you just tell us a bit about sort of what you were up to before you began making Radio On, and maybe kind of what you felt like you were reacting to going on around you when you made the film?
Well, I mean, to jump ahead to now, it wouldn't have stood a dog's chance of being made. Nobody would have touched it. At the time, I was the film editor of Time Out magazine in London, which involved running a team of reviewers and basically reviewing all the films on in London. It was a good job, but I wasn't a vocational critic. And I couldn't see much future in it, and I couldn't see much future in anything. But it was still technically possible through the example of the French New Wave, people like Lindsay Anderson, to graduate from writing about film to making film. How one did it was another matter, but I was lucky because through working at Time Out, I met Wenders, Wim Wenders, who by then he'd made The American Friend, and he was about to go off to America to work for Coppola. I liked his films for their documentary quality, the kind of the topography of a landscape, this sense of a German landscape which had never really been seen properly since, well, for many years. And yeah, so I interviewed him, and I said, "Oh, I've got a script," because by then I had actually had a first draft of Radio On, which was really just based on the idea of no story, a journey through a landscape, weather, a documenting of a landscape or a little scene landscape in a similar kind of way to the Wenders films, and a load of music, because the other thing about cinema in those days, it didn't actually use, they had film scores, but you didn't hear the songs you liked in films, and it seemed a pretty obvious thing to do, with the exception that film music rights were prohibitively expensive, as they had to be cleared through various societies. So again, shortcuts were available. It was possible to meet, by me posing as a music journalist, to meet Kraftwerk, to meet David Bowie, to meet Stiff Records, and say, "Oh, would you give us a load of your material for not very much money?" And that again was done. About 35 years later, I tried to get in touch with Ralph Hutter again about pulling off the same stunt, and I couldn't get near him. He was ring-fenced by lawyers, never got close. So it was a moment, and as I say, if I tried to do it now at that age, I wouldn't have even got through the door. So, and the other thing to say about English cinema at the time was it was pretty dead in the water. There wasn't much going on, and there wasn't much sense of kind of possibility. So this film, which is financed by the British Film Institute Production Board, was the narrowest way in that it was a fund for novice filmmakers to make films cheaply with union dispensation, so you didn't have to have a full crew, and in that sense, it was perfect. You know, I was given a lot of support. We had no money, but it was. I thought it was going to be like that forever.
Hmm. And yeah, I mean, I think you you pointed in this direction a bit just now, but you know, I'm interested in Radio on Status as like as a road movie, and what the film is doing topographically and in terms of documenting the landscape, but yeah, it's just the road movie as a genre or like a generic category of film is like of course very interesting, and it's been applied in, you know, a lot of different ways. And I'm wondering sort of if there was, did you have a kind of attraction to at least that sort of format before this before the encounter with Wenders, or do you think because a lot of his film, some of his films from this period are also sort of like fall into that that category, and he was also doing interesting things to sort of deconstruct the road movie as it was known at the time. So maybe could you tell us a bit about sort of the genesis of this interest, and like, yeah.
It was pretty personal. The only worthwhile exam I ever passed in my life was my driving test, and you could buy cars pretty cheaply in those days, and it gave me a sense of independence, of freedom. I was sufficiently interested in the English landscape to explore it quite a lot. And then I suppose when I started thinking about making a film, and at first I had no intent, I wasn't particularly ambitious. I didn't, while I was reviewing films, I didn't particularly harbor a desire to direct anything. But as I said, I thought, it could be seen as a logical progression. And my initial effort was only to produce a script. And I thought, well, what am I qualified to write a script about? And I thought, I'm not at all interested in English class or relationships, or the ground covered by the English middle class novel, or the social realism, which was predominant in English cinema at the time. I would have quite liked to have made a Hammer horror film, but that was beyond my capabilities. So it came down to a process of elimination. I thought, think of a point between A and B, cover that ground. I knew the road pretty well that we filmed on, and the other thing I'd worked out in a slightly fancy way was that both driving and film are a form of forward projection. So to put the camera in the back of the car is not illogical. And we were quite rigorous about that. That on the whole, the camera stayed in the back of the car. And the other obvious thing was that as someone who'd never made anything involving film before, it's a simple format. Basically, the most you can get in a car is 4 people. Someone once said the most depressing sight in the world is a car full of 4 men. But so it followed on from that, and I thought, well, if I get the music right, then I don't have to write a lot of dialogue, and I think I'd also worked out that any emotional content that the film had should come from the soundtrack and not from the characters. So it was always a pretty spare vision. In terms of the road movie, I thought Rudy Wurlitz's script for Two Lane Blacktop was pretty exemplary in that you know, hardly anything was said. And then there was that kind of slightly distancing device favored by Antonioni. So I thought, you know, I wasn't aiming for much below degree 0 or medium cool at the warmest. So that was the, yeah, I mean, I think that answers the question.
Yeah. And the sort of spareness that you were referring to is of course like it's reflected in the films. I think the kind of visual idea of the film. And so I guess I wanted to ask about your collaboration with Martin Schäfer. He was, I believe he's a Wenders camera assistant initially, right? Yeah. And so I'm interested, yeah, I guess just in how the two of you sort of worked out what the look of the film and how it would sort of pair with this concept you had for what the audience would hear while watching the film. But also I was reading an interview with you the other day where you pointed to this Alain Resnais quote, or it was from an Alain Resnais interview in Sight and Sound, where he was talking about London as being a definitively surreal city. And I'm curious if that kind of how that sort of informed your approach to filming London and beyond, since you go beyond.
Well, to go back to Resnais, it was a Sight and Sound article, and I think he was talking about shooting a Belgian detective series in London, because he said that London was the most surreal city he knew. And there were some photographs taken from the East End. And I remember one day I had a really very, very dull job selling advertising space over the telephone. And it was a fine autumn day, and I called in sick, and I took my camera down to the East End to see if Resnais's theory was correct. And it was. And I've always kind of kept that in the back of my mind, although Radio 1 is not a surreal film in any way. But I think the Resnais episode taught me to look at things in a different way in terms of what was interesting and not interesting, because the conventional concept of English landscape is very different from its reality. And also, I was a big fan of motorways. In London, there's the Westway, which stretches from the Euston Road to Shepherd's Bush. It's not very long. It's only about a mile or so, and it's elevated. I mean, you have them all over the place there, but London had nothing like that. I remember the first time going on it, you were skimming along at 70 at rooftop level, and I just thought, this is fantastic. So I suppose over time, I kind of accumulated a way of looking at things. Interestingly, it was always assumed later that I'd been influenced by J.G. Ballard, who in fact I hadn't read at the time, but it emerged that there was a kind of parallel between the two of us, and possibly because we were both colonial boys who'd been kind of raised abroad. So, you know, you saw England in a different way. But to go ahead to Schäfer, my only audition for the film as a director was sitting in the back of a taxi with Wim Wenders. And he asked me if I had anyone in mind to direct the film, to which the answer was no, not really. And he said, well, I think you should direct it. Before that, he asked me how would I shoot it? And I said, well, 35mm black and white. And I think that got me the job. The obvious choice to shoot it was Robbie Muller, who was Wenders' cameraman. But Muller wasn't available, and I asked Wenders, I said, well, who's Robbie's assistant? And that was Martin. Not knowing, I was kind of naive enough to assume that assistant cameramen, you know, would be good cameramen in their own right. But I was very lucky with Martin because I think he'd done one movie for Rudolf Thome in Germany, but he was ready to shoot something, and we went on a recce. I took him to some of the locations. We got to a particularly bleak field with a pylon in it. And I said, well, how would you frame that shot? And he kind of showed me the frame. The pylon was bang in the middle of the screen. And I thought, well, I've got my man. And he was very sensitive to the kind of texture of film. And he wanted to shoot on Ilford, which was a comparatively rare stock by then. I think Goddard used it. And it was quite difficult to get hold of. But he said the thing about it is it gives you a better black. I mean, the blacks are really black. And I think in one of the things about the restored print is that Schäfer's choice is justified because the blacks are really black. So, and yeah, that was pretty much that. We got Martin Muller, who was Wenders' sound recordist, as part of the package. We had a crew of 12, and you kind of knew everyone. So the actual shooting the film was not difficult. And they were Martin and both the Martins were, you know, experienced enough to be able to kind of tell me when I was making a fool of myself. And it was a very good collaboration.
Yeah. And I wanted to go back to the soundtrack for a moment, since yeah, I think the whole backstory of how the soundtrack came together is quite interesting from what I've read. And you mentioned this sort of your time as a music journalist, music critic, but sort of with an eye towards I guess, you know, obtaining the music for the soundtrack.
Only with an eye to doing that. I hadn't, you know, I wasn't at all qualified to be a music critic, but yeah. I just thought, well, you know, how do you get to Kraftwerk? I should probably say about the music, if I'm not interrupting the question, that okay. When the Germans came on board and Road Movies in Berlin became the co-producer, as I said, there had to be German elements involved. And that's what really crystallized the soundtrack, which is the perfect time because there was that shift around then towards that whole kind of Berlin, Cologne-based German music with Bowie having his low period in Berlin, and Kraftwerk. And the thing about their stuff was it was the most cinematic music I'd heard. You know, I thought it was wonderfully cinematic, and an absolute gift. So, you know, that the German connection decided those choices. You know, if it had been a purely British film, I don't know whether I would have had the imagination to come up with Kraftwerk. But because, you know, I was bound to bolster the German side of things, it was a logical, it was an easy choice.
Yeah, I mean, those sorts of chance elements are obviously really interesting, but I'm also wondering kind of about, because you're talking about your desire that the soundtrack should sort of be the kind of emotional substance of the film, which already suggests this really, you know, I think a very interesting kind of relationship between image and sound in the film. And maybe could you elaborate a bit on kind of how you conceived kind of, so it's, you know, it's like one thing to say the soundtrack should comprise the kind of, or that's where the emotional experience of watching the film comes from, but also then like, you know, sort of working out the particulars of what that would entail.
Yes, the obvious thing to say is that whoever came up with the idea of putting a radio in a car was a genius, and whoever came up with the idea of adding a cassette machine to the radio was even more of one, because it meant that you could, for the first time, program your own soundtrack while you were driving. So, which, you know, radically changed the experience of driving, and that led to the decision that whatever music was in the film, it should come from a source. You know, you couldn't just play, although we did at the end, you couldn't just play the soundtrack over images in the conventional way. And it always struck me that when, you know, pop music was used in films, it was done in not very imaginative ways, and not that often actually. So, you know, when it came to the pub on the road and I wanted to play Reckless Eric singing Whole Wide World, I thought the audience should be made to sit and listen to the whole of Whole Wide World. That was, you know, I mean, you know, again, playing, finding the right length to play stuff. I mean, almost my favorite scene is where he goes to the car wash and he sits in the car listening to this very hopped up version of Satisfaction by Devo. And it's a single shot. And if that were all that were ever left of my work, I'd be, you know, I'd be quite proud of it. And so that was, I mean, the other thing to say was that the other deal we made was with Stiff Records. So I got a bunch of records that, you know, I wouldn't have normally have chosen, but they gave me the catalog to go through. And so I just picked out the stuff which I thought would work. I mean, I think there were a couple of people who turned us down. I think Elvis Costello turned us down because I was quite keen on a track called Watching the Detectives. And I think Nick Lowe did too, for a track called Endless Sleep, which, you know, I don't miss either of them. And I think the one thing I stand by is that, you know, however many years later, it's a pretty cool soundtrack. It doesn't really put a foot wrong. There's not, I can't think of a single song where you think, uh-oh, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing I didn't want it, because we were in post-punk, and I didn't want it to be too obvious or contemporary. So I thought, no Clash. We don't have the Clash singing whatever, London Calling. And I think, you know, because the choices were slightly off kilter, like Lena Lovitch or Reckless Eric, it means that the soundtrack remains interesting, because you're not suddenly swamped by some terribly familiar piece of Sex Pistols or something. So, so it was a kind of, yeah. I thought the film was DJ'd fairly well.
I would concur. It's for me at least one of the great greatest ever film soundtracks. I also wanted to ask about you know, there are a lot of very interesting sort of like however brief walk-on roles, cameos, you know, what have you in the film. And I think I've gotten the sense from like interviews I've read, you know, that I've heard you do, that it's, you know, I think you're probably pulling a lot from maybe your network of friends, fellow travelers, etc. But could you tell us a bit about the I guess like casting the film and sort of populating it with these people, and I guess, you know, how people like Sting and Lisa Kreuzer, and even I believe even the Great British Baking Show's Paul Hollywood is in a scene.
No, it's not. I'm sure it's not him. I hope not.
It's just the internet then.
His name was Paul Hollywood.
Yeah.
And he was a local kid that we found.
Oh.
And years later, I thought it can't be him.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's not. But okay. Yeah, there was him, and then in another scene, I won't say which one, the guy was the local weed dealer from when I was a student in Bristol. So there was an element of casting from the back catalogue. We got Lisa Kreuzer through Wenders, who more or less asked me if I could find a part for her, which there wasn't at the time. But I kind of ripped off Alice in the Cities and took the idea of this single mother looking for a child. And I quite liked the idea of screeds of German being spoken in the scene with no subtitles. With the other casting, well, let's get Sting out of the way. Sting was in the Police. The band hadn't broken. They were kind of coming up. He had an extremely pushy acting agent who was trying to get him the main part. And I asked a friend about the Police, a friend who knew a lot about music, and he was not particularly polite about them. But because the agent was pushy, I agreed to meet him. And I just thought, well, he's going to be a star. So there's no harm in casting him. I didn't want him for the lead, but again, there was this scene which refers to the death of Eddie Cochran. There were no characters in it. There was just a reference to it as he drove through that location. And I thought, well, I can stick Sting in a caravan as this Eddie Cochran freak and write a scene, which in fact they largely improvised. And it was I felt sorry for the main actor because he'd been put through such a hard time for 2 weeks. He hadn't been allowed to talk to anyone. And when he did, it was to this kind of violent squaddy in the car who kind of starts beating himself up. So I thought, well, just relax and let them get on with it. But the scene veers towards, levity in my view. And the other thing, of course, is that he sings 3 Steps to Heaven by the petrol pump at the end. And that was the idea of the 2 Martins, the 2 Germans. And they came up with this idea. And in fact, we'd had to go back for a second day to finish off the shooting because we hadn't done it all in the one day. And they came up with this idea about putting him up against the petrol pump to sing the song. And I said, that's an awful idea. It's really awful. And, but then, I mean, everyone was so tired and pissed off that I thought, oh, well, give them what they want. I can always just not put it in the film. And of course, it's in a way, it's the scene that allows the film to carry on because it gives it a lift it otherwise wouldn't have had. Sandy Ratcliffe, who was in the film, she'd been in a Ken Loach film, very good, and later went on to become a kind of soap star in EastEnders. The biggest problem we had casting was the main actor. I couldn't find anyone. I looked at a lot of people, and I had a casting director called Irene Lamb, who was very good, and she kept on pushing David Beams, and I said, no, he seems all wrong to me. Part of it was he had red hair, and I thought I just don't see this guy having red hair at all. Not, forgetting that we were shooting in black and white and it didn't make a bit of difference. And in the end, I went with him. And I think it took me about 20 years to appreciate his performance in that I asked him to do nothing. And if you ask most English actors to do nothing, they still find ways of stealing the scenery. But Beams was good to his word, and he does nothing. He does nothing, and it's perfect. I mean, I think it's a very fine piece of cinematic acting. The only notes I gave him was I showed him the Robert Mitchum film Out of the Past, and made him look at Robert Mitchum. I said the thing about Mitchum is that he listens. His acting is to do with listening. It's not to do with reciting the lines. And it's through listening that he can recite the lines, and I think Beams understood that. And I feel sorry for him because I thought he deserved more of a film career than he got as a result of working with me. And that's, I don't know, it's small cast, but let's hope it's not Paul Hollywood. I'm really worried about that.
Well, yeah, let's hope that's just that's an invention of the internet or something. But I've just as my last question. You just mentioned sort of like it taking 20 years or so to appreciate David Beams's performance, and I guess that coincides with I believe the last time you revisited this film with the Radio On remix in 1998. I'm curious. I'd be curious to hear about your your impressions of working on the restoration with the BFI and revisiting the film now, having revisited, because it has this feeling of it's like every 20 years and go back to Radio On and try to find something new. And I think there is quite a bit that this film, you can learn from this film today. So yeah.
Well, first off, I'm amazed that it had any life at all. We did Radio On Remix because basically we were asked to by a couple of Bristol students who managed to get some money from the local television station, because and it was supposed to be a documentary about that flyover, which is used outside the hotel, which at the time was being dismantled. So the landscape of Bristol was changing. I mean, they got us a bit of money, and we came up with Radio On Remix, which I suppose was in response to the changing technology and the technology that was available. And the film was pretty much structured around the fact that I gave 20 cassettes of the original soundtrack to Bruce Gilbert of Wire and said, can you mash these up so that we don't really recognize any of it. And in those days, he used to post the stuff through the mail to him, and then he'd post it back 10 days later. And the stuff came back, and then after that, it was dead easy to put together. Radio On came out again, I think in 2007, and again I was surprised. And then in 2009, we made another film which is not so well known, although it's shown on TV in Europe, called Content, which was really another road movie in that it was a kind of ambient remake of Radio On. And now 10 years after that, Radio On is back again. And I can two things I can say. And one is to get in a story I do want to tell, which was that when the film was shown in 1980 at the Museum of Modern Art, the first question from a woman at the back was, "Why did you make such a boring film?" To which my answer was, I didn't set out to make a boring film. I set out to make a film about boredom. And if you were really that bored, then you should have done the obvious thing and walked out. It's not, you weren't forced to stay. When the film came out, it was perceived as being a very slow film, verging on boring. And when I saw it again recently, I thought, gosh, it's almost too fast now. It's almost as though it's kind of shrunk. And I thought, why is that shot so short? And I think time has been very kind to it, in a way that it possibly hasn't been to other British films. And in the end, there's nothing else like it. No one else did it. And it had no follow-on. There was it didn't suddenly sort of produce a spate of English road movies. It just sort of was there as this kind of landmark, easily forgotten, but somehow it's sort of lurched on from generation to generation and still seems to have some sort of meaning and life. And I think a lot of that's to do with the music, that in a way that's what holds it together. But since about 2007, on the whole, it's had a sort of fairly easy ride, in that, people seem to get what it's about in a way that they didn't necessarily when it first came out. But, I don't know whether that answers the question or
no. Yeah, no, it does, and it's also I believe it's a good place for us to leave it for now. But I just want to thank you very much for joining us and for making the film. And also I want to thank the film's US distributor, Fun City Editions, for making it available to us. Thank you to the BFI, etc. But yeah, thanks, Chris.
Not at all. And I hope the festival goes well. I hope the screening goes well, and good luck with everything.
Yeah.
So goodbye from Rotterdam.
So long.